Chapter 11 focuses on political crimes. There are many types of political crimes. They take many forms. Sometimes it is the government or the officials engaged in the crime, such as corruption. And there are crimes that are committed against the government. Generally, political crimes are illegal acts that are designed to undermine an existing government and threatens its survival. These acts can be nonviolent or they can be violent. Nonviolent, such as a government employee disclosing top secret national secure documents, or they can be violent, like 9/11, an act of terrorism that we'll talk about. And we'll talk about each specific political crimes themselves and what motivates an individual to commit such an act. But first I want to start with the story that is in the beginning, or the case. It's not much of a story. It's true. It's not a make-believe, but it's a case that's at the beginning of the chapter. And it has a lot of messages. So I'm going to kind of read it as it is and then add to it. It's important. Consider, as you listen or reread it from the book, consider our rights as individuals, and then look at it from the perspective of Mr. Assange and Miss Manning. Specifically free speech. We have this constitutional right of free speech. And that just doesn't mean to speak. We have, these things to say and to criticize, our government, for example. But we also have the right to receive what other people are saying, i.e. get information about what our governments are doing. So with that background, let's start with this case. You may be very well aware of the website called Wikileaks. It's an international organization that publishes classified and secret documents submitted by anonymous sources. It was launched in 2006 and run by Julian Assange, who is an Australian who immigrated to Sweden. Wikileaks has supporters all over the world. A few years ago, the site began to post videos and documents that had been illegally appropriated from U.S. diplomatic and military computers by unknown hackers. One video showed a 2007 incident in which Iraqi civilians and journalists were killed by U.S. forces. It also leaked more than 76,000 classified war documents from Afghanistan, including U.S. State Department cables. In the aftermath of the leaks, Army Specialist Bradley Manning, who is now Chelsea Manning, who's 22 years old, was arrested after an informant told federal authorities that he had overheard Manning bragging about giving WikiLeaks a video of a helicopter assault in Iraq, along with more than 260,000 classified U.S. diplomatic cables taken from government computers. Both the U.S. and foreign governments mortified when the confidential cables hit the net. Manning was ultimately charged, convicted, and sentenced to 35 years in prison for leaking the classified material. WikiLeaks again made headlines in April 2015 when it published over 30,000 documents and over 173,000 emails hacked from Sony Pictures Entertainment. The material allegedly had been stolen by North Korea's intelligence service in revenge for Sony producing the comedy film called The Interview, which depicted the future overthrow of the North Korean government and the assassination of its leader, Kim Jong-un. Many of the hacked emails proved embarrassing to the studio, including ones mentioning actors' pay and others joking about President Obama and race. But WikiLeaks was not done. During the 2016 presidential election, the site published emails that had been hacked from the Clinton presidential campaign computers. While the revelations were not particularly controversial, the site was accused of playing politics. Russian hackers were suspected of being behind the data breach. If the Russian connection could be proven, it meant that WikiLeaks was aiding foreign interference into U.S. elections. In response, Assange issued a statement that says the right to receive and impart true information is the guiding principle of WikiLeaks, an organization that has a staff and organization mission far beyond him. The organization defends the public rights to be informed. This is why, irrespective of the outcome of the 2016 U.S. presidential election, the real victor is the U.S. public, which is better informed as a result of our work. The U.S. public has thoroughly engaged the Wikileaks election-related publications, which more than 100,000 people were reviewing. Millions of people were looking at them. Anyway, is this First Amendment? Is this having this information leaked and available to Americans related to the First Amendment? Is Assange a hero or is he a criminal? It depends on who you ask. Just to further the story, because there's lots more to this story. At the time of the writing in the book, Assange was wanted on a series of charges in Sweden from a sexual assault. He's been threatened with extradition to the U.S. to face charges. He was granted asylum by the government of Ecuador, and he remains in their London embassy, and has been, still is. Manning, who's now Chelsea Elizabeth Manning, had her sentence commuted by President Obama just before he left office, and she walked out of prison, free woman. And the Sweden government decided to drop the charges against Assange, even though he remains in the London embassy. However, in recent times, the U.S. Justice Department has launched a criminal investigation. The prosecutors sought charges against Julian Assange. In 2019, the federal grand jury charged him with an 18-count indictment, among other things, unlawfully obtaining and disclosing classified documents and obtaining property of the government. And these documents relate to national security, as well as aiding and abetting Manning and obtaining other such documents in an attempt to injure the United States or advantage foreign nations. These kinds of crimes fall under our treason and espionage crimes, which we're going to talk about in detail. Trump claims Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, somebody else we're going to talk about momentarily, who leaked information, U.S. confidential information to the press, as acts of treason. And I'm going to note that Manning was subpoenaed to testify at this grand jury proceeding, but she refused, and then she was ultimately held in contempt of court and was then resentenced to more jail time. And we're going to talk about the crime of contempt. Currently, the United States is trying to extradite Assange from England to bring him back here to face these charges in the indictment. This is still ongoing as of September 2020. Everything's been on hold because of COVID. But there is a legal proceeding that is happening in London to get him to return here. We'll see what happens. But back to the question, is he a hero or a criminal? You know, they disclosed information that showed us, the American people, and lots of other people, the true human cost of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Do we have a right to know? What about Edward Snowden, U.S. government worker who disclosed that the government was spying on us through advanced technology? Invasion of privacy. That's what he claimed as an invasion of privacy. He felt he had to disclose it. He's currently in Russia, granted asylum. He's fearful to be returning because the president wants to charge him with treason, but others call him a hero. They made a movie about him. He's given awards. So when it comes down to these political crimes, it's really hard to tell. Of course, you know, there are the uprising in the Middle East that have emerged in the last decade, including revolting against dictators such as Gaddafi. We have an ongoing civil war in Syria. Political crimes stem from religious or ideological sources. And unlike the violent crimes we previously discussed, with the goals being for selfish reasons, like profit or revenge, those violent crimes. With political crimes, the offenders consider themselves as doing something for the greater good, or they're selfless. The government is tasked with keeping the nation safe from domestic and international attacks, as well as protect itself from appearing weak and corrupt. While most citizens agree with government involvement, controlling the extreme behaviors, i.e. terrorism, They may not be so agreeable to laws that control or censor political dissenters or those who wish to expose the government or keep citizens informed as the acts of government. Isn't that why we elect these folks? We need to know what they're doing so we can keep electing them or vote them out, right? National security is the issue that affects the entire country. So most of the laws in this area are going to be deemed federal laws. Crimes against the nation include treason and espionage, as well as terrorism. There's also election fraud and political corruption. These crimes can be both federal and state, and these are crimes that also undermine the government or make them appear to be weak. So, without further ado, why does someone become a political criminal? Why there is no pattern or one reason that motivates one to commit a political crime. Political crime expert Randy Borum has identified a pattern in the way ideas are formed. There's a four-stage process. Stage 1, and this is outlined in the book, but it's worth a discussion. Stage 1, it's not right? Things aren't, that's the first step that someone thinks things aren't the way it should be. They identify some undesirable event or condition. And there's a number of them going on in the country right now. You can think of one off the top of your head. Lack of order, poverty, unemployment, I'm being discriminated against. That's not right? That's the first step. And then it goes, that's not fair. So this identified undesirable event, condition, is an injustice. Doesn't apply to everybody equally. And step 3, it's your fault. Someone or some group must be accountable for the individual's displeasure. So then they've identified a potential target. And then it's your evil. So when someone group is deemed evil, it dehumanizes that person or that group and deems them an appropriate target for revenge. And here, aggression becomes justifiable when aimed at bad people. So consider the example from the book. We talked about him in the last chapter, Dylan Roof, the individual who shot in the church in South Carolina. A lot of hate crime criminals fall under this pattern, right? It becomes more than a hate crime, which is generally the law that's charged in these kinds of cases. It is also a political crime. You will see some overlap, in hate crimes and other crimes when we discuss terrorism. But he's not charged with the crime of political crime. He's charged with hate crime. That is, in his case, charged by some political or the stage process. So it's also deemed a political type of crime because that's kind of what's motivating him to do that act. And we see this with domestic terrorism too. When we get there, I'll point it out right here, but when we get there, there is no charge of terrorism. You commit a terrorist act on U.S. soil. Those folks that do that, some of the examples we talked about last time, we'll talk about coming up when we talk about terrorism. They get charged with, murder or a hate crime or a weapons charge, but they get deemed a terrorist because they fit the definition. It's the same thing with political crimes. You don't get charged with domestic terrorism. It's not an actual crime. All right, so let's talk about specific types of political crimes. On that note, keeping this pattern in mind, election fraud. This is a great way to begin this week, right? We're a week and a half out or so to a very big election. Election fraud, what is it? Generally, illegal interference with the process of an election. It is election fraud. My question is it election fraud when the president, while campaigning in North Carolina, told his supporters to vote twice, one by mail-in ballot, and then go to the polls and vote too? Is that an act of election fraud? Acts of election fraud tend to involve affecting vote counts to bring about a desired election outcome, whether by increasing the vote shared of the favorite candidate or depressing the vote shared of the rival candidates, or combination of both. Why would someone want to affect the election? Well, meet their own personal needs. They want someone with their own political views. Profit, if a candidate paid for them to vote a certain way. They didn't care one way or the other. They got paid so by profit. Election fraud has been around since the early Roman times. Besides throwing out ballots, there are other behaviors that constitute election fraud. Intimidation or threats, right? Contacting the individual voters and threatening them. Disruption, sabotaging polling places or calling in bomb threats at places where opponent is more favored. Misinformation. This appears to be kind of lax. Some of the social media sites were taking hold and limiting political posts when you give out misinformation. We're in the world of misinformation right now. False facts, false news. Not a lot of folks being prosecuted for that. It's certainly hard to prove in some instances, but social media runs rampant with this. And there are some social media sites like YouTube that were removing ads with intentional misinformation on it. But when the content is especially wrong, like the wrong election day, sending, to the opponent's supporters the wrong election day, or say, the rules have changed when they haven't, or your voting site changed and it hasn't. Those are pretty strict misinformation rules. Registration fraud, getting out of the area residents to submit change of address forms when in fact it hadn't changed. This does happen on occasion. It's happened up here in the North Country, and it's usually this resident component that is the idea, and especially see it in primaries for tipping smaller party scales, where it really means a lot to get on a ticket under a different party name. Vote buying, the reason why in a lot of states it is illegal to take your picture with the ballot, by the way, a completed ballot, and then show it to someone, i.e. post it on social media, because it constitutes proof of your vote. So the sense is that it's easier to buy. Someone can say, I pay $1,000 to vote for such and such president, but they don't really know what you're doing inside the booth. So getting you in a picture of your ballot and showing it is an easy way to have that proof. But it is illegal in a lot of states, including New York. Other states say it's a violation of free speech. Bigger problem arises with absentee ballots, because you can buy those from the voters. But in some states, there's restrictions. They would have to actually have the person fill it out right in front of you, because you have to, if someone's buying a vote, you have to actually sign the back of the envelope with your signature. It has to match up. All of the states and the federal government have laws criminalizing election fraud. Besides the federal laws that are cited in the book, states have a number of other acts that constitute election fraud, including casting a vote more than once. So back to my question, is it election fraud when the president, while campaigning in North Carolina, told his supporters to vote twice, one by absentee ballot and then go to the polls and vote? Yes, the powers that be in North Carolina were frustrated when he said that. He said that's going to suck for the poor voter who actually does that, because in North Carolina it's a felony. Actually, in most states it's a felony to commit election fraud. They want to put a harsh punishment on something like this. So it is for the individual who actually follows through and does that. Is voter fraud common? You might think it is, with all that's been going on in the last 2 elections. But the research shows it is not quite common, and it's really a bunch of hype. Quite frankly, it's ineffective and difficult to pull it off with individual voters. Obviously, we're in the world of the technology age and hacking and so forth. is a big problem. But these things we see, down in Florida with the hole punch and all the different types of voting processes that are not only state to state, but county to county and town to town, use different types of ways of voting. Having across the board same rules would be wonderful, but it's not that case. States are in charge of doing their own elections. But that's up to you to decide, because it is a hot button topic of whether it's common or not common. I tend to lead towards the idea that it's not as common as we think, and that it is heightened by the news and the media. There are states that require identification to vote. And, the rule behind that was an attempt to cut down fraud, so you actually have the person. Others say that you're restricting my right to vote. They feel that it's voter suppression because not everyone has an ID, because you need like your driver's license or a state issue ID or a military card. They're really specific. New York does not require an ID, and you shouldn't be asked to show your ID. So our next political crime: abusive office, public corruption. What is it? It is a breach of public trust and or abuse of position by government officials. And we'll visit this again when we talk about white-collar crimes, along with bribery and extortion in the next chapter. Government officials can be elected, appointed, or hired. The point is that they are committing a crime while in their office. They demand, they solicit, they accept, or agree to receive anything of value in return, using their official capacity to do a private favor or to be manipulated in their performance of their duties. The benefit could be for them directly or for their families. So the question is, who's the victim? The general public. Right? We end up paying higher taxes or inflated costs as a result of these actions. The book has some examples of corruption. Those found guilty spend time in prison. Do you think public officials who accept a bribe should go to prison? It's not really a dangerous crime. Some others think the public punishment, like public service and volunteering, might be the better option. How funny that is. The people who actually make the laws, politicians, think that the punishment for that kind of conduct should be a community service and volunteering and not being put in jail. It's kind of comical. In 2013, Governor Cuomo passed the Public Trust Act to crack down on corruption. Preventing public corruption is essential to ensuring that government works and can effectively keep the public's trust. The Public Trust Act recognizes that crimes of public corruption should be treated more seriously than other white-collar crimes, because when they break the law, they also break the public trust that the people have placed in government. And the new laws created stiffer jail sentences. And there have been a number of politicians in New York since then who have been prosecuted. I attached an article to the forum post on this issue for you guys to look at. So the next political crime: treason. This is the only crime defined in the Constitution. It's the Third Amendment. Treason is an act of disloyalty to one's nation or state. While the crime of treason is well known, the word traitor is the generic term. There have actually been fewer than 40 prosecutions for treason the entire history of the U.S., and most have resulted in acquittal. Because treason is considered such a heinous crime, and to deter would-be traitors, many nations apply or have applied the death penalty to those convicted of attempting to overthrow the existing government. Treason was considered particularly loathsome in England under the English common law, and until the 19th century, it was punishable by being, quote-unquote, drawn and quartered, a method of execution that involved hanging the offender, removing their intestines while they were still living, and finally cutting the offender into 4 pieces for public display for treason. Acts can be considered treason in order to stifle political dissent. 18th century England, it was considered treason to merely criticize the king or his behavior And not surprisingly, the American colonists feared giving their own central government that kind of power. This is why treason is the only crime mentioned in the Constitution, which defines treason as levying war against the U.S. or adhering to their enemies, giving aid and comfort. And it also requires the testimony of 2 witnesses or a confession in open court for the conviction. The purpose of this was to limit the government's ability to bring charges of treason against opponents and to make it more difficult to prosecute those who were so charged. Today, the Federal Criminal Code codifies treason as whoever, owing allegiance to the U.S., levies war against them or adheres to the enemies, giving them aid and comfort within the U.S. or elsewhere, is guilty of treason and shall suffer death or shall be imprisoned not less than 5 years, so there's a mandatory minimum of 5 years, and fined under this title of not less than $10,000, and shall be incapable of holding office under the U.S., and this is a felony level charge. So those who levy war against the U.S. or believe in or follow the enemy or help the enemy in some way, intentionally doing so, will be considered treason. So helping and cooperating with the enemy in the time of war, or creating and recruiting a military force to help a foreign nation overthrow the government is another example. There's a bunch of examples in the book. Aaron Burr, who killed Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton in a duel over honor. He was accused of hatching a plot to separate the western states from the Union. When that went awry, he conspired to seize Mexico and set up a puppet government with himself as king. He was arrested and charged with treason, but the Supreme Court said you need more than just planning to be guilty of treason. You actually need an act. And in this case, there wasn't an act, it was just a plan. In 1859, John Brown, a abolitionist, and a group of his supporters captured citizens and seized the federal armory and arsenal at Harper's Ferry in Virginia, which is now part of West Virginia. Brown had hopes for creating a popular slave rebellion. He was convicted of treason against the Commonwealth of Virginia and executed for attempting to organize armed resistance to slavery. And treason wasn't and isn't just for the men. After World War II, a Japanese-American woman born in Louisiana and known as Tokyo Rose, and a woman born in Portland, Maine, known as Axis Sally, served prison terms for broadcasting for the Axis powers during World War II. The Axis powers were known as Rome, Berlin, and Tokyo, that military alliance that fought against the Allies, in an effort to demoralize American troops. I want to talk about sabotage. This is not in the book. It is another political crime, though, so I want to note that it is here. You should know about it. I'll start with an example. 2 men claiming to be a part of an anti-government militia cut down and removed valuable copper communication wire from a railroad utilized by the United States military. Both men do this in an attempt to stop the government from delivering military supplies and classified information to a nearby naval base operating by the U.S. Navy. They are caught in the act but claim innocence. Is there a crime here? There is. It's called sabotage. Under a federal crime, it's a federal crime. The general meaning of sabotage is defined as destroying, damaging, or defectively producing property with the intent to impede the nation's ability to prepare for or participate in war in national defense. Producing property might be you're charged with making bulletproof vests and then you intentionally not make them bulletproof. That would be doing so, or producing property with the intent to impede the nation's ability. So as you can see from the example, the 2 men are actively attempting to stop the military from receiving information related to national defense. While the men may be doing this as an act of protest, the effect is to what? To kind of slow down the Navy's ability to communicate or even stop it. So this is considered sabotage. You can have sabotage during war. One of the key components of these laws is that 2 of the types of sabotage. One happens during wartime and the other one can happen during peacetime. And sabotage is more often prosecuted than treason. One more notable example happened in 1942 during World War II when Nazi individuals came to the U.S. in U-boats in an attempt to sabotage the war efforts. They were ordered to attack transport hubs, hydroelectric power plants, and industrial facilities. Specifically, they were ordered to sabotage New York's Pennsylvania station, the city's water supply power plants, bridges, and some owned department stores. But the effort was stopped when the FBI caught up with them. So sabotage, that is another type of political crime that you should be aware about. Espionage, also called spying. This focuses on crimes that are a threat, again, to national security. And I love the story from the book of Robert Hansen, was a counterintelligence agent for the FBI assigned to detect and identify Russian spies, a former Chicago police officer. His assignment required him to have access to sensitive top secret information in one of the most shocking cases in U.S. history. He had volunteered to become a paid spy for the KGB during the Cold War. And over a period of 15 years, he had received $1.4 million in cash and diamonds. He was eventually arrested in 2001 after leaving a package of classified documents for his Russian handlers under a footbridge in a park outside Washington, D.C. During his years as the double agent, he not only provided more than 6,000 pages of documents to the Soviet Union, but also caused the death of 2 U.S. double agents whose identities were uncovered with the aid of his secret documents. He was charged, convicted, and is serving his multiple life sentences in a supermax prison. But espionage is the practice of obtaining information about a government or organization or society that is considered secret or confidential without the permission of the holder of the information. The criminalization of these acts depends on whether the acts occurred during peacetime or during war. This is the act that Julian Assange is charged under, and Army Specialist Manning was charged and convicted under, as well as Edward Snowden, who's also known as a whistleblower. During peacetime, it is a criminal espionage to gather, transmit, or attempt to gather or transmit defense information with the intent that it will be used to damage the U.S. or assist a foreign nation. It's a felony offense. During war, it is espionage to collect, record, publish, or communicate information about military activity or to attempt any of the foregoing with the intent that the information will be transmitted to the enemy. That's a felony too. And what's the penalty? The maximum penalty? What could you imagine it is? Death. Could be life without prison, but it could be executed as well for espionage. State political crimes. And when I say state, I don't mean like New York, Connecticut. We're talking about the government. This is when the government is committing crimes. Its own crimes. State crime is an activity or failures to act that break the state's own criminal law or public international law. So the government's committing its own crime against the people they're supposed to serve. And criminologists argue that the states break its own law in an effort to maintain power or uphold the class advantages of those that support the government. They may even go to war to support capitalists who wants resources from other countries, and there's a number of examples in the book regarding this. The most notorious state crime is torture, used to gain information from suspected, I like how they say suspected political criminals, and a suspected political criminal can be anybody that might have a last name that's connected with somebody who has or is really a political criminal. One type of torture, it's in the book, waterboarding, subjecting a person to near drowning experience by pouring water over their face with their heads leaned back. You may have seen that on TV. Other forms, though, include shocking, beating, stretching, whipping, burning, electric shocks, rape, other form of sexual assault, hanging, crucifixions, teeth and fingernail extraction, being attacked by animals, there's just being injected with chemicals. There's a whole bunch. Sleep deprivation. Most people disagree with torture tactics, but in certain situations, some people deem that it's justified. The ticking bomb scenario is under one of those circumstances where people seem to think that that is okay, where a known criminal knows the whereabouts of an explosive that is going to go off and kill innocent people. So torture can be used to get that to extract that information. Can the torture of a suspect terrorist determined to destroy the government and harm innocent civilians even be permissible? Or is there always an example of the state-sponsored political crime? This is where torture walks the fine line. Some pose that a torture warrant should be put in place, and this is something that a judge issues. In cases where there is an absolute need to obtain immediate information in order to save lives, and there is reason, or probable cause is the fancy legal term, to believe that the suspect has that information and is unwilling to reveal it. What do you think? Right? Torture is commonplace. Amnesty International estimates that torture is inflicted by over 3/4 of the world's governments. Tortures recently have been illustrated in the treatment of those detained under war of terror suspicions in Iraq, Afghanistan, Cuba, and elsewhere. We'll talk more about state-specific crimes and under terrorism and how countries use the terrorism against their own people. So that brings us to the conclusion of why people commit political crimes. We're going to turn and some specific national security type crimes, and now we are going to turn to terrorism. It has its own category in and of itself, but it is considered a political crime.